Welcome to Hourglass Secrets. Tonight we venture into the quiet streets of Richmond, England, in the closing years of the 19th century, a time when the bustle of London seemed a world away, yet even in these modest terraces, darkness was quietly taking shape. This is the story of a woman whose desperation would tip the balance between life and death, and whose name would haunt the memory of a small household forever. This is the true story of Kate Webster. The suburb of Richmond, with its orderly cottages and well-kept gardens, exuded calm. But behind the neat facades, life was not always as tranquil as it appeared. In one such house, No. 2 Vine Cottages, lived Mrs. Julia Martha Thomas, a widow in her mid-50s. She had long valued order and precision in her home, treating her household with the care of someone who knew the fragility of independence. For years she had relied on domestic servants to maintain her routines, yet the constant turnover of help had made stability a rare luxury. It was in this world of careful routines and small measured expectations that Kate Webster arrived on January 29, 1879. Recommended by a local woman, she presented herself as a hard-working Irish servant eager for work. On the surface, everything seemed ordinary: an employer welcoming a new servant, a woman seeking employment. But beneath the politeness lay subtle, almost imperceptible tensions, the kind that, in hindsight, marked the start of something far darker. At first, the arrangement appeared satisfactory. Mrs. Thomas noticed nothing unusual in Kate's presence, while Kate seemed eager to please. Yet neighbours would later recall a flicker of unease. The occasional raised voice, a minor delay in completing tasks, and a subtle awkwardness that seemed to hang in the air. These minor irritations, almost dismissible in isolation, were the faint tremors preceding a quake that would soon shake the household to its core. By late February, the strain had begun to crystallize. Kate's attention to her duties faltered. She moved through the house with a distracted air, her obedience less certain, her answers tinged with reluctance. Mrs. Thomas, whose expectations of order had been unwavering for decades, grew increasingly frustrated. She attempted patience, yet the small disturbances persisted, creating an invisible barrier between mistress and servant. The narrow rooms of the cottage left no space to escape this tension. Every encounter seemed loaded with an unspoken friction that neighbours, overhearing snippets, could not ignore. On February the 28th, after weeks of growing dissatisfaction, Mrs. Thomas made a simple yet fateful decision. Kate's services would no longer be required. A routine act in the context of Victorian domestic life, it was an administrative formality, yet it would prove the pivot on which tragedy turned. Kate remained in the house for a short time, allowed by custom to seek a new situation, but the fragile equilibrium had been shattered. Within the close walls of Vine Cottages, uncertainty and quiet unease took hold, setting the stage for events that would erupt in horror in the days to come. Before we begin, please hit subscribe and tell me, what state are you listening from? The days following Kate Webster's dismissal notice were heavy with a quiet, almost suffocating tension. The small rooms of No. 2 Vine Cottages, once filled with predictable domestic rhythm, now seemed to pulse with unease. Every creak of the narrow staircase, every footstep on the worn wooden floor, carried with it the weight of unspoken friction. For Mrs. Julia Martha Thomas, a woman who had long relied on order and discipline, this irregularity was more than inconvenient. It was unsettling. Kate moved through the cottage with a deliberate, almost calculated air. She sorted belongings, shifted furniture, and examined personal items, actions that could have been attributed to idle curiosity, yet carried a subtle, unnerving purpose. Neighbours observed her at odd hours, lamps burning late into the evening, footsteps echoing in the hallways when silence should have reigned. There were faint, fleeting smells, odd and difficult to identify, lingering near the kitchen door, something ordinary yet subtly wrong, a signal that the household's equilibrium was fraying. Small arguments, once the occasional irritation of daily life, began to punctuate the quiet domestic routine. Mrs. Thomas's clear expectations clashed with Kate's hesitant compliance. Words were exchanged, voices raised, and doors closed sharply, reverberating through the narrow rooms. Outside, neighbors noted the discord, speaking quietly to one another of the changes in the usually orderly home, yet none could foresee the darkness gathering just behind those walls. For Kate, the dismissal notice was a signal of opportunity as much as it was a threat. She was a woman accustomed to maneuvering through precarious situations, someone who had experienced conflict in previous employments. Her actions now suggested she was carefully orchestrating her next steps, measuring Mrs. Thomas's routines, observing the surroundings, and perhaps considering the vulnerabilities within the small household. There was cunning in her gestures, an almost imperceptible calculation that the casual observer might miss. Days passed, each more tense than the last. Mrs. Thomas remained vigilant, attempting to preserve normalcy, while Kate's movements grew increasingly deliberate. She lingered in rooms alone, arranged items with meticulous attention, and at times seemed to slip into the presence of her mistress's personal possessions with a quiet familiarity. The cottage, a space once governed by habit and routine, now felt claustrophobic, as though the walls themselves held the anxiety of the occupants. Yet outwardly, the household maintained a fragile calm. No further disputes erupted in public, and neighbors saw little overt sign of the storm brewing within. But those who observed closely, the careful eye-catching details others might overlook, noticed small inconsistencies in Kate's stories, a subtle impersonation of her mistress, and an unusual confidence in her movements. In the small, contained world of Vine cottages, every action mattered. Every deviation from routine became a silent note of warning. As the week drew on, a sense of inevitability began to settle over the cottage. The fragile tension between mistress and servant had transformed into a quiet, simmering danger. Beneath the surface of ordinary domestic life, a choice was forming, one that would lead to irrevocable consequences. In these seemingly mundane days, history was quietly taking shape, and the calm streets of Richmond would soon be shattered by a crime that would haunt the Victorian era forever. By the beginning of March 1879, the atmosphere at No. 2 Vine Cottages had grown heavy with unspoken tension. Mrs. Julia Martha Thomas, a woman whose life had been measured and orderly, was unaware that the calm she valued was about to be shattered. Kate Webster, the seemingly compliant servant, had begun to slip from the bounds of ordinary domestic behavior into something far more deliberate, her movements and actions carrying the faint, chilling precision of someone concealing a dark plan. On Sunday, March the 2nd, Mrs. Thomas left the cottage to attend her regular service at church. The streets of Richmond, sun-dappled and serene, bore no hint of the tragedy that was about to unfold behind the modest walls of her home. Kate remained in the house, moving through rooms with a strange deliberation, occasionally glancing at her mistress's possessions as though measuring their value. Lamps burned later than usual, and faint odours lingered in corners of the kitchen, details that neighbours would later recall with uneasy clarity. Upon Mrs. Thomas's return that evening, the tension intensified. Kate's manner had subtly shifted. She spoke in measured tones, her answers precise but distant. Moments of hesitation, small inconsistencies in her explanations, and her unfamiliar familiarity with Mrs. Thomas's clothing and personal effects began to form a pattern of deception. Observant neighbours later recounted seeing her dressed in garments similar to those of her mistress, yet Mrs. Thomas herself was nowhere to be seen. Over the following day, March the 3rd, Kate's actions grew increasingly deliberate. She rearranged items within the house, carried bundles from one room to another, and spoke inconsistently about her mistress's whereabouts. Each step she took was cloaked in the ordinary motions of domestic life, yet beneath them lay an unnerving premeditation. The cottage, once a haven of routine, now seemed constricted and tense, as though it recognized the danger brewing within its walls. By March 4th, Kate's intentions became tragically clear. She requested the assistance of a young local man, Robert Porter, to move a large, heavy box, claiming it contained household refuse she wished to dispose of. The box was cumbersome, requiring effort to lift and carry, and Robert later recounted hearing a heavy splash as it was thrown into the River Thames near Richmond Bridge. Unseen by him, inside the box lay the final grim consequence of Kate's calculated deception: Mrs. Thomas herself. In the days that followed, the neighbourhood absorbed the shock in quiet increments. Kate, displaying a chilling composure, began selling items belonging to Mrs. Thomas, including furniture and clothing. Her explanations were plausible yet inconsistent, each one carefully designed to obscure the truth. Observers noted her movements, her interactions, and the odd familiarity with her mistress's belongings, sensing, even then, the threads of wrongdoing that would soon unravel completely. The crime had transformed a modest, orderly household into a scene of cold calculation and unthinkable betrayal. What had begun as a routine dismissal of a servant had escalated into a meticulously concealed act of violence. Within the narrow walls of Vine Cottages, Kate Webster had executed a plan that would shock Richmond, captivate the Victorian public, and forever mark her name in the annals of true crime. In the quietest houses, under the most ordinary roofs, the darkest deeds can take shape, and often the first signs are almost impossible to notice. The quiet of Richmond was shattered on the morning of March 5, 1879. Along the banks of the River Thames, fragments of a human body floated, carried by the slow current toward discovery. Panic and disbelief rippled through the neighbourhood. Number 2 Vine Cottages, once a house of modest domesticity, was now at the centre of a horrifying revelation. Authorities were summoned immediately, and the first threads of a meticulous investigation began to unravel the fate of Mrs. Julia Martha Thomas. Neighbours' recollections became crucial pieces of the emerging puzzle. Kate Webster had been the last person seen inside the house, and her recent behaviour now assumed a more sinister significance. Her inconsistent statements regarding her mistress's movements, the possession and attempted sale of Mrs. Thomas's belongings, and the suspicious transport of a heavy box toward the river, all pointed toward deliberate concealment. What had seemed like ordinary irregularities in domestic life were now unmistakable indicators of criminal intent. The constables quickly traced Kate's flight from Richmond. She had fled to her native Ireland, seeking refuge among relatives in County Wexford. Yet even across the sea, the law was relentless. By March 29th, the authorities apprehended her, bringing her back to London under strict guard. Throughout the journey, Kate's demeanour was chillingly composed. She offered contradictory accounts, sometimes denying any knowledge of her mistress's disappearance, at other times attempting to shift blame onto others, including a local publican, John Church, and the porters, who had unwittingly assisted her in moving the box. Upon her return, the police began meticulous inquiries. Witnesses were called to recount every detail. Mrs. Ives, a neighbour, confirmed she had last seen Mrs. Thomas on the evening of March 2nd, noting Kate's unusual appearance the following morning, dressed in her mistress's garments. Robert Porter and his father described helping Kate with the heavy box and the sound of a splash as it entered the river. The medical examiner confirmed the remains were of an adult woman and consistent with a violent death. Each statement, though seemingly fragmented on its own, began to form a chillingly coherent picture. Public fascination was immediate. Richmond, a quiet suburb, now found itself the focus of morbid curiosity. Conversations whispered through streets and cottages, questions of motive, opportunity, and the audacity of a servant who could commit such a deed. Kate's calculated escape and the precision with which she concealed evidence added layers of intrigue and horror to an already shocking event. As authorities pieced together her movements, a pattern of premeditation became undeniable. The stolen items, the deliberate misdirection of neighbours, and the flight to Ireland all spoke to a mind working carefully to evade detection. Every small detail from the objects she touched to the clothes she wore became evidence of a deliberate, unrelenting pursuit of self-interest at the cost of human life. The case was no longer simply a disappearance. It was a crime scene, a pursuit, and a moral labyrinth. Kate Webster, once a seemingly ordinary domestic servant, had become the center of a relentless investigation that would test the limits of Victorian policing and public curiosity. The stage was set for a trial that would grip London, challenge perceptions of justice, and reveal the terrifying consequences of trust betrayed. Even in the quietest corners of a city, the ripples of a single act of cruelty can spread far, drawing in neighbours, authorities, and history itself. By July 1879, the case of Kate Webster had captured London's attention. The Old Bailey, the city's central criminal court, was packed with onlookers drawn by a mix of horror, fascination, and curiosity. The disappearance and murder of Mrs. Julia Martha Thomas, a seemingly ordinary widow, had shaken the community to its core. Now, all eyes were on the woman who had entered Vine Cottages scarcely a month before and emerged at the center of one of the most chilling crimes of the era. The courtroom buzzed as witnesses took their places. The neighbors, the porters, and others who had encountered Kate in the days surrounding the murder recounted their observations with painstaking detail. Mrs. Ives, the neighbor who had last seen Mrs. Thomas alive, described the odd sight of Kate dressed in her mistress's clothing the following morning, her explanations inconsistent and strangely rehearsed. Robert Porter and his father testified about helping her transport the heavy box, noting its immense weight and the sound of it striking the river, a splash that would later become a grim echo of the crime itself. The Crown prosecutor presented the evidence with deliberate clarity. Each testimony, every object sold by Kate, and her abrupt flight to Ireland painted a vivid picture of guilt. The medical examiner confirmed that the remains recovered from the Thames belonged to an adult woman and bore signs consistent with violent death. Though forensic methods were rudimentary by modern standards, the circumstantial evidence formed an unbroken chain pointing toward one individual. Kate Webster remained outwardly calm throughout the proceedings. Her composure, however, did little to disguise the fact that she offered no coherent defense. She called no witnesses, and her explanations fluctuated, alternately denying involvement or attempting to implicate others who had merely been unwitting participants in her schemes. Each inconsistency only strengthened the prosecution's case. In the eyes of the jury, the facts converged into a damning narrative. The last person seen with Mrs. Thomas, found in possession of her belongings, fleeing the scene, and manipulating those around her. Observers in the courtroom noted her demeanor, a calm exterior masking the full weight of her predicament. Yet the law, unflinching and methodical, moved steadily toward its conclusion. After days of testimony, the judge provided instructions, emphasizing the coherence of the evidence and the severity of the crime. The jury retired, leaving the fate of Kate Webster in their hands, the tension in the courtroom palpable, as silence descended over those who had followed every chilling detail. When the verdict was returned, it was swift. Guilty of murder, Kate Webster had no avenue left to escape the law. The sentence of death was pronounced, a grim acknowledgement of the deliberate, cold-blooded nature of her actions. Justice, though harsh, reflected the values and procedures of Victorian England, a society that demanded order, accountability, and punishment for breaches of both law and moral expectation. The trial, with its meticulous collection of witnesses, testimonies, and evidence, not only sealed Kate Webster's fate, but also captivated public consciousness. It was a stark reminder of the vulnerability of domestic life, the ease with which trust could be betrayed, and the devastating consequences when human cunning met opportunity. The story of Vine Cottages, once quiet and respectable, now echoed through history as a tale of horror, deceit, and the final reckoning that would claim the life of its perpetrator. In a courtroom, every word, every gesture, can weigh heavier than the darkest intentions, and in the end, the truth finds its way, no matter how carefully it is concealed. On July 29th, within the austere walls of Wandsworth Prison, the sentence of death was carried out. The execution, precise and unflinching, marked the end of a brief but devastating sequence of events that had begun in the quiet, orderly Vine Cottages. In the eyes of Victorian society, justice had been served, yet the shock of her crime continued to ripple through the streets of Richmond and beyond. The weeks leading up to the execution were tense and fraught with anxious speculation. Kate, calm and composed on the surface, made one final assertion, claiming she was with child. This plea, rooted in established legal custom, required formal examination by a jury of matrons. Their careful assessment, however, found no evidence to support her claim. The law, unyielding and methodical, moved forward, leaving no room for delay or deception. Kate's fate was sealed. Public interest in the case lingered long after the sentence had been confirmed. Newspapers recounted the chilling details with fascination, dissecting the audacity of a woman who could infiltrate a household, betray trust, and commit murder in a society that prided itself on propriety and order. For neighbors, witnesses, and the wider community, the trial had offered not just facts, but a glimpse into the terrifying possibilities of human deceit. The Porters, unwittingly drawn into her schemes, eventually resumed their lives, bearing the memory of that day's events quietly, while Mr. John Church, the publican falsely implicated by Kate, reflected on the unsettling inconvenience her actions had caused. The execution itself was solemn and swift. Within the prison, the procedures were carried out with meticulous care, reflecting Victorian England's approach to capital punishment. There were no dramatic outbursts, no last-minute pleas, just the stark, unflinching conclusion demanded by the law: Kate Webster's life end, and with it, the direct consequences of her betrayal and violence. Yet the story persisted, lingering in the collective memory as a cautionary tale of trust, opportunity, and human cruelty. In the years that followed, the case of Vine Cottages continued to be referenced in discussions about domestic service, small household vulnerabilities, and the limitations of contemporary investigative methods. The crime highlighted the dangers inherent in placing trust in strangers, particularly within the intimate, private spaces of home life. Historians and criminologists would later study the case as an example of how ordinary domestic interactions could conceal extraordinary malice. For Richmond, the quiet suburb forever bore the shadow of the events that had transpired within No. 2 Vine Cottages. The memory of Mrs. Julia Martha Thomas, her life ended so brutally and unjustly, lingered among those who had known her. And though Kate Webster's execution closed the legal chapter, the story of deception, calculation, and violence she enacted remained a haunting reminder of human capacity for cruelty. In the calmest homes, where order and routine seem unshakable, darkness can quietly take root. The tale of Vine Cottages endures, a grim reflection of trust betrayed and the irreversible consequences of human malice. Please hit subscribe and tell me, what state are you listening from?